Thank you for joining today's session on UDAAP Coming into Focus. This session is part of the third Thursday regulatory briefing series for virtual compliance management. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. During the session, all participant lines will be muted. We do welcome your questions, though, in the chat window of your join.me app. We will aggregate those questions and ask James to address them at the end of the briefing. In addition, we will email a copy of the slides used today as well as a link to the recorded session so that you can play it back later for reference or can share it with interested colleagues. With that, I would like to welcome James DeFrance, today's facilitator. James is a consumer and real estate lending compliance specialist with more than 30 years of experience in banking. He has served as a senior compliance examiner at the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco and has served as the Commission's National Bank Examiner at the OCC. James holds a BA from Dartmouth College and a JD from the University of San Francisco with a concentration in banking and finance. He is a certified regulatory compliance management and anti-money laundering specialist with experience in fair lending, consumer operations, non-deposit investment products, note department operations, BSAs, CRAs, and the entire credit approval process. James, welcome, and thank you for facilitating today's session.
And thank you. Thank you all for attending our briefing. Just a quick reminder, we do these live every third Thursday of the month. We have a number of topics that we've already scheduled, but if you have some ideas, we invite you to go to our website and contact us with your ideas, and we'll see if we can work those into our briefings. We always enjoy hot topics. Today we're going to talk about UDAAP, the Unfair, Deceptive, Abusive Acts or Practices Act. Not only is it a mouthful, it is one of the most misunderstood and fearsome regulations that exist in compliance. This is one of the areas, UDAAP that is one of the areas that can result in a violation even though you have technical compliance. So you could have dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's with Reg B and Reg Z and still have a UDAAP issue. The other thing about UDAAP is it can be found in any area, not just lending, not just operations, and it actually has now blended over into some commercial areas too. I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute or two. So far, UDAAP hasn't been used a lot, but I'd say yet there for a reason. In March of 2015, the CFPB released its Supervisory Highlights publication. This publication details recent findings and enforcement actions taken by the CFPB. It also details areas of focus for the future. And the CFPB in this publication made it clear that UDAAP is going to be an area of focus. Now, for community banks, they're not necessarily regulated by the CFPB. But here's the thing that we've learned. If it's important to the CFPB, it's important to your regulator too. So even if you haven't experienced it in 2015, soon UDAAP is going to be an area of focus. So how do you prepare? Well, the way we like to prepare is to start at the start. Let's talk about where UDAAP came from. UDAAP was originally just UDAAP, that is the Unfair, Deceptive Acts or Practices Act. And it really started during the Great Depression. Like most consumer regulations, there is an outcry because of misbehavior by banks and financial institutions. During the Great Crash, consumers found out that many of the promises that had been made by businesses were not being kept. Insurance companies didn't pay as promised. Department stores had promised refunds, and they didn't pay. Banks closed overnight. And here's the thing. A consumer who was defrauded only often found out that the fine print in the contracts immunized the seller or the creditor. Consumers could fall back only on claims such as common law fraud, which requires rigorous and often insurmountable proof of numerous elements, including the seller's state of mind. So even if a consumer could mount a claim, and even if the consumer won, few states had any provisions for reimbursing the consumer for attorney's fees. So as a result, a consumer who won a case against a fraudulent seller or creditor was rarely made whole. They couldn't even get attorneys because attorneys couldn't get their fees. So UDAAP was passed. UDAAP originally, as I said, was just unfair, deceptive acts or practices, and it was administered by the Federal Trade Commission. The original law was designed to address things like contract and mortgage fraud, but the big problem was that the FTC was not a banking regulator or even an insurance regulator. It was just trade, and it really didn't have the staff or the resources to enforce the regulation. So at a minimum, the enforcement was lukewarm. Well, 2009 changed everything. Of course, we had the financial meltdown, and that included the passage of the Dodd-Frank Act. The Dodd-Frank Act, of course, changed many things, but among them was supercharging UDAAP. It added an additional A to UDAAP, and so it became the Unfair, Deceptive, Abusive Actions or Practices Act. UDAAP with two A's goes beyond extension of credit and introduces an enterprise-wide focus on all the products and services offered by your institution. The CFPB has been given the authority to bring enforcement actions under UDAAP, and considered at a high level, UDAAP is more of a concept than an individual set of regulations. The idea is that dealings with the public must be fair and that financial institutions should, in fact, look after the best interests of its customers. Even though there are a great number of laws that deal with required disclosures such as Reg Z, Reg DD, and so forth, financial products such as loans and certificates of deposits, these laws generally do not deal with the fairness of the terms or the possibility that a consumer might unwittingly agree to additional fees and terms and go well beyond the agreed interest rate. UDAAP is designed to address that problem. And remember, the CFPB has made it clear that this is going to be an area of emphasis going forward. So let's talk about some of the terms. Now, I'm going to take this directly from the regulation. So the definition of unfair. An unfair practice is one that causes or is likely to cause substantial injury. The injury cannot reasonably be avoided, and the injury is not outweighed by any sort of benefits. So what this really means is that if a customer has to pay fees or costs because of some act by the bank that's deemed unfair, then a substantial injury has occurred. It's important to note that, or interesting, not necessarily important, but the description of the regulation doesn't say that the injury has to be monetary. It can be emotional, but we haven't found any examples of emotional injury. This section, the unfair section, is most often applied to overdraft programs. Now, I told you before, there are cases now where UDAAP has bled over into commercial programs. We know of a bank that was doing overdrafts for a number of commercial customers. They even had one customer who, when interviewed by the FDIC, said he had considered the cost of an accountant and decided that it was easier for him to just pay overdraft fees. It was easier and cheaper. So this bank had gotten the okay of its customers before actually doing overdrafts. Despite that fact, it was ordered to reimburse customers because the overdraft fees were deemed to be unfair. What is deceptive? A deceptive practice is a practice that misleads or is likely to mislead a customer. That is, a reasonable consumer could be misled. Reasonable in this case means someone with at least an 8th grade education. If there's a presentation, omission, or practice that's material, if all those three things exist, then a practice is considered deceptive. By the way, I should point out that if you have an unfair, deceptive, or abusive, it doesn't have to be all three. If the practice is any one of these three, then you might have a UDAAP violation. To determine whether an act or practice is misled or is likely to mislead a consumer, you have to take the totality of the circumstances. So any programs that include the possibility of late fees or additional fees as the result of balances, usage charges, or any fees that are in addition to the initial fees all have the possibility of being misleading. We found that this section is most often cited when the language used in disclosures doesn't match the language in advertisements or that's on the website. For example, in one case, the bank called a fee a maintenance fee in its advertisements, but called it a monthly fee in its disclosures that it gave to customers at the time it opened its accounts. This was considered a deceptive disclosure. Abusive. Here, the practice materially interferes with the consumer's ability to understand a term or condition of a product or service, or the practice takes unreasonable advantage of a consumer's lack of understanding of the risks, costs, and conditions of a product or service. This area probably has the greatest potential to increase liability. We have to be really careful in watching this area, and what it really means is that you have to make sure that you do everything to make sure that the customer understands the terms and conditions of a product. The CFPB description of this portion of the regulation notes that a consumer can have a reasonable reliance on a financial institution to act in his or her own best interest. This means that for products or services that are offered that have the ability to add fees or costs, there's an affirmative duty to make sure that the customer knows exactly what they're getting into. A couple of examples of UDAAP. The first one, debt collection and ACH payments. Here, examiners noticed that a bank, when attempting to collect delinquent accounts, collectors offered consumers a reoccurring ACH payment option. When informing the customers about this payment option, the collectors promoted the customer's ability to adjust or cancel an ACH payment within 24 hours notice. This really contradicted, however, both the express representation in the monthly periodic statements and the actual internal policies and procedures of the bank. As it turns out, 72 hours notice was required. So the contradiction in the oral and written disclosures of the time frame required to cancel or change or adjust a reoccurring ACH problem created a risk of deception and was a UDAAP violation. In another case with overdrafts, a bank represented that if there are electronic or ACH payments, that they wouldn't charge an overdraft fee with respect to those electronic payments. So if you, for example, paid your insurance through your checking account, the bank said if it's an automatic payment like that, they wouldn't charge overdrafts, when in fact they did. So in that case, once again, there was a representation that didn't match what the actual practice of the bank would be. In both cases, both fees, fines, and reimbursement were ordered. So how do you prepare for UDAAP? First, remember that all fees must be disclosed to a customer up front. So if there's a fee, if there's any way, shape, or form the customer is going to get charged, make sure that those are disclosed up front before the customer accepts the product. Always disclose the worst case scenario. What's the worst thing that can happen? What's the most that I would have to pay as a consumer? It's always the best practice to let the customer know that they're going to be charged a fee before they actually are. It's also important to make sure that all your written materials, electronic materials, and scripts, if you use them, whatever it is your employees are telling the customer, all agree. As a compliance professional, if you notice a large increase in fees in any sort of particular product, it's a really good idea to take a look and see if there may be some UDAAP implications. So if you've started a new overdraft program and you seem to be getting a whole lot of overdraft fees, that would be a good time to take a look and make sure that there's no potential UDAAP problems. Thank you.
We have a few questions that have come in, so we will address those a couple at a time. Catherine, can you with that first one, please? The person says, what are some of the penalties that can be applied for a UDAAP violation?
Penalties that can be applied for a UDAAP violation are vast. So under UDAAP, you could have civil money penalties, you could have reimbursements, you could even be ordered to do a look back. And a look back is a situation where you could be ordered to look at a particular product and look back 2 years at that particular product, see what fees and services have been charged, and be made to reimburse customers for a particular fee for 2 years. So the fees that can and penalties that can be the result of the UDAAP can be tremendous.
The next question says, do examiners perform a UDAAP examination?
No, here's the thing. There's no, right now, there's no UDAAP unique examination. In fact, what examiners do is they look at certain products as part of a consumer examination, sometimes safety and soundness, and look for patterns. Again, they're looking for large fees being charged customers or high amounts of interest that sort of go outside what the norm is, and that's how they find UDAAP. So it really lurks in all different areas, but there's no specific UDAAP examination.
Okay. The third question says, are there ways to test for potential UDAAP violations?
Yeah, the best way to do it, again, is to just take a look at your fee income and see if there's any sort of spikes or jumps in it. The other thing I would suggest is to just do a quick audit and make sure that in all your disclosures, the disclosures that you hand customers versus what you have on your website versus what you put in your advertisements, make sure that the terminology is the same in all of them. Don't call something a monthly fee one place, an annual fee another place, and a maintenance fee in a third place. Those would be best practices.
All right, and this is the last question. What are some areas other than overdrafts when UDAAP violations may occur?
One area that I think is going to be interesting going forward is the area of flood insurance. And in those cases where a customer has purchased flood insurance that exceeds the minimum. So you've told the customer they need $60,000 worth of flood insurance, but they purchased $80,000. I believe that section, that UDAAP section on the deceptive section, creates an affirmative duty on the part of the bank to tell the customer, hey, you have more insurance. You may have more insurance than you need. I think it's important for the bank to be able to say, whatever amount of insurance you bought, it's more than we told you. And I think that's what UDAAP is saying. You have an affirmative duty to let the customer know that the amount of insurance they have exceeds what you've asked them to do. So stay tuned and pay attention to that. I think that's coming down the road.
All right, we had one more question come in. It says UDAAP did not replace UDAP. The specific rules that UDAAP had previously outlined still apply, correct? And UDAAP is still under FTC Section 5.
It is, but the CFPB has the ability to enforce it now. So, and I didn't hear the first part of the question. I'm sorry.
All right. The first part of the question says UDAP with 2 A's did not replace UDAP with 1 A. The specific rules that UDAP with 1 A had previously outlined still apply, correct?
That is correct. So what it did was expand. Technically it did replace it, but what it did was keep those old rules and then expand.
All right, that was all the questions we had. Thank you, everyone who submitted those. If you think of a question later that you did not get answered or have a chance to ask, please do visit the VCM for You website, and we would be happy to take care of those questions there. Again, we will email a copy of the slides and a link to the recording following this. So we encourage you to take a look at those and to join us again on the third Thursday in October. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.